This afternoon, we are joined by Neelu Gibson with BD. She's just recently joined BD, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, who will be our keynote speaker today. And then on our Q&A panel, we have Dane and Luis. I'm going to have each of you guys do your own intros because I cannot do you guys justice. So Neelu, go ahead.
I think you pretty much covered it actually. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak. Yeah, I've joined BD about 4 months ago. So I think I was in the office about 2 weeks before COVID hit. So welcome to my remote office now. With that, I'll turn it over to Dane.
Thanks, Neelu. It's great to be joining you all today. My background, grew up in Australia and spent some time in the UK and since globally supporting the engagement of consultants and contingent workers, largely in the oil and gas industry, but more recently here in the life science industry the past couple of years. So I now reside with my wife and family here in San Clemente, California, and really enjoy being a part of the Orange County and Southern California community, and particularly learning more about how we can partner with ULP.
Wonderful. My name is Luis Jimenez. I'm the third panelist and also act somewhat as a moderator today. My background is also in the life science industry. I have over 12 years of experience. I also serve as a president of OCRA this year. OCRA is an Orange County Regulatory Affairs Group. I encourage everybody to check that out as our organization is growing. It's staying very active throughout the pandemic. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Brandwood CKC. It's a global international regulatory consulting firm. So the topics are very opportune to what I do day in and day out. My background is entrepreneurship. Before joining Brandwood, I ran my own medical device company from the ground up. That was a spin-out from a university technology. So very glad to be here and share some thoughts, experience, and most of all, some questions.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Neelu. Neelu with her presentation about the do's and don'ts of regulatory affairs.
Right. Let's see if we can make technology work, shall we? Okay. You guys all see everything okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, let's get going. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you all today. As I thought about what I wanted to cover, the key thing that came to mind was just sharing some experiences with you. So before I do that, I would love to understand who our audience is. So with that, let's use this fabulous technology to do a quick survey. So how would you describe your organization? So if you would take a moment to respond to that, that would be great. I'm going to do it too, turns out. Oh, okay, let's see. So 40% is startup entrepreneur. That's great. Industry 20. All right. Thank you for that. All right. The next question that I have for you is, have you worked with regulatory affairs before? This is so exciting, waiting for results. Okay, that's not too shabby. All right, good to know. All right, then let's look at question 3. So for those of you who have worked, actually even the ones who haven't really engaged with reg affairs, how do you perceive the regulatory function? Is it a black box? Is it clear and transparent, or somewhere in the middle? Okay, that's a fair assessment, I think. Thank you for doing that, because it kind of helps me craft my conversation with you all a little bit. So thanks again. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start with the simple why. Okay, this is not going to be some existential discussion, but something that I think we need to keep at the forefront of our minds. For those of you not familiar with Reg Affairs, I'm literally going to cover it in 3 bubbles. I know it's going to be a feat, but let's try it. And then to the 2 topics that we're going to be talking about today, which is when to engage, and then the do's and don'ts of what to do with your regulatory partners. And then finally, a little bit about working with consultants. And of course, you have to have a word about the impact of COVID-19 on our industry. And I will obviously talk about it with the regulatory lens. So let's start with our why, right? So what drives you to be in the field that you're in? Why healthcare? Why biotech, right? Why do you do what you do every day? And I'm trusting that you're going to say it's something a little bit more than because I need the money, because I think this is an important question. This to me is sort of a foundation that inspires us to do what we do every day, right? So my why has evolved a little bit over time, but for the last almost 30 years, it's sort of stayed the same. So mine is to positively impact patient lives by bringing innovative medical devices to the global marketplace, right? So my lens is actually based on working for over 22 years with Johnson & Johnson. I've had businesses, 7 of them that I supported from a regulatory standpoint. I was on 5 management boards, and now with Becton Dickinson, right? So what I've learned in that whole time is that bringing safe and effective products to our patients is the paramount thing that we do. Being ethical and responsible stewards of our business is essential because we do impact patient lives, not faceless patients. These are our families and friends. My mom was actually in the ER recently, and she was hooked up to an infusion pump. That pump, the Alaris system, is my device at BD. So the answer to my why is what drives me to show up to work every day. So what's yours? And keep that at the forefront of your mind as we continue this conversation. As promised, let's talk about regulatory affairs in 3 bubbles. So simply, if you work in a regulated environment, you benefit from having a solid regulatory affairs professional or people on your team. So over the years, I've been accustomed to having the quizzical look that turns glazed very quickly when I try to explain to people what we do in reg affairs, right? It at the simplest is multifaceted. Just to basically spare all of you from having those virtual glazed looks, I'm going to bubble it down to 3 key areas. And yes, I said bubble. So each bubble that you see has numerous bubbles supporting it. The pre-market piece speaks to new product development. The post-market is processes and essentially product changes that you have after you launch your product into the market. Ad promo is another activity to think about. And then the last bubble, it just doesn't get as much love as it really deserves. And that is processes and procedures and best practices. Those words might sound like nails on a chalkboard to you guys, but these things are important as you move forward in your businesses, right? Particularly the entrepreneurs amongst us, that is something so far into the distance, but something worth thinking about as we have this conversation. So a little bit about each one. Yes, I'm a Trekkie. So, and I also put down circa 1966, right? To boldly go where no man has gone before. New product development, really, from a regulatory standpoint, the early engagement that you have with your RA partner can help you with questions like, what are your target markets? What claims are you looking for? Do you have a clear regulatory strategy? And submissions. We love our submissions. But again, which ones and why? All of these things are something that can be helped along by having a solid RA partner. So I once took, when we talk about like how early an engagement should you have, I think the one example that really came to my mind was basically flying from California to Michigan in, I think it was November, December timeframe. So it was not the warmest. And I went with my R&D partner with a handle for a catheter. We took a handle to an electrophysiologist so that we could get his initial feedback on that design, right? So you guys might be wondering, it's like, yeah, I can see R&D going to do this. Why the heck was RA there, right? And the reason I went along was because I wanted to understand the perspective that this electrophysiologist brought to the table and how that would impact not just my US strategy for clearance, or actually in this case, approval, but how it would impact OUS as well. So again, that early engagement with RA was helpful not just to the project, but also to me personally as an RA professional supporting that project. So let's talk a little bit about post-market, right? So you have authorization to legally market your device, awesome, or drug, or app, whatever product that you're engaged in. How are you planning on making any future changes, right? Are you guys thinking about having a website? Rhetorical question. Really, right? So promotional materials. So that cool physician that wrote that whole thing with their research that they did on your device, are you able to publish that? Again, in this regulated environment, you will need guidance from an RA professional to help see that. So one good example that comes to mind to me around this post-market arena was at a company where we were making a process change to something that we manufactured over and over again, right? So the RA assessment, basically one of the things that we do, right? So we get input from the manufacturing folk and say, hey, these are the changes we're going to make. And do we need a registration in the US or elsewhere? So we did the assessment for the US and it came back as a letter to file, which means you don't actually have to do a submission. And so, I was talking to the team by phone in the good old days. And essentially there was one guy on the phone who said, letter to file. Wasn't expecting that. And then the conversation moved on and I was kind of going, why is this one guy saying this, right? So anyway, at the end of the conversation, I picked up the phone, I called him and I said, hey, so, it was kind of interesting that you said you weren't expecting it and that it was a surprise. He goes, well, with all the changes we're making, I'm just really shocked that it was a letter to file. And I said, well, these are the 5 changes that we were told about. And he goes, well, what about the 25 process changes we were making? Turns out that somebody had made the decision that we will tell regulatory about the 5 manufacturing changes, but not about the 25 process changes. That effectively kicked the assessment from a letter to file into doing a 510K submission, right? So again, if it's just one of those small things, if I hadn't bothered to call and say, hey, what do you mean? This might have caused a huge compliance issue for the organization, right? So I think just keeping things like that in mind as we navigate the post-market environment, the smallest thing can make a difference between having to notify something to an agency, having a documentation in your files, or having some other action. And also, if you're a global company, it could just have a ripple effect across all your regions. So just keep that one in mind. I think the other one that's important in this group that I want to touch on a little bit is the concept about monitoring the external environment. Regulations are like the Saharan desert, they shift all the time. I don't know where I got that one, but it sounded good and here it is in your presentation. So essentially this one for me is also really fascinating because how do we stay current? Because we're living in the now, right? For new product development or even the post-market world. It's like, what are we doing? How is our product doing? How is our portfolio doing? But keeping that eye on the horizon for what is upcoming. So staying on top of, things like OCRA are fabulous at keeping, us abreast of new regulations and requirements. There are different areas where you can find that information. And then you need to do an assessment as to, does it impact our product today, tomorrow, or a year from now, right? Great example around that with one of my I always call them my past lives. So in a past life, we became aware of a directive that had come out probably 2 years prior. And it impacted basically our full portfolio. So the way we found out was one engineer was aware of it. And during a conversation, he said, hey, by the way, do we meet X? And then the team went back and said, well, hang on a second, what do you mean X? It goes, well, for my portfolio, for my device, I made sure that we had the testing, that we did that. But then the question came up as to, well, did we do it for everything else? And turns out there actually was an impact and the team had to then, manage through doing remediation associated with that. So just keeping an eye on the horizon, and I'm not saying you scour it every day relentlessly, but having a plan or a process in place where you do have your finger on the pulse, I think is a huge thing to remember. And again, I touched on the ad promo piece. that is such low-hanging fruit for pretty much all regulators. What you put on your website, it's really easy for a regulator to just kind of go, hey, I wonder what BD is doing, or so-and-so company at J&J, just pick one, right? And the information that we present, again, in the regulated environment is really important for us to vet as far as, do we have the data to support what we're saying? Are we making the right claims? What pictures do we have up there? Is the font correct? All of these things, again, should be under the purview of your regulatory representative. So with that, I'm going to switch gears. I know I'm kind of blasting through this a little bit quickly, so if you need me to slow down, somebody make a gesture and I will. All right. So the last one that I wanted to talk about is essentially the bucket around processes and best practices. Let's move on to a Battlestar Galactica quote, right? So all this has happened before and all this will happen again. So we do need processes, right? Keep in mind, chances are you will iterate your designs, you will have new offerings, you may go into partnerships, right? You may do acquisitions or divestitures. So do you want to figure out how to do it over and over again? Or is it better just to have a simple procedure or a simple process that's a roadmap for how you did it before successfully and how to do it again? And similarly, this will also help manage through some of those landmines that will come up if you're not prepared for them. So just think about that one as well. Now, the fun part. How do you engage with your regulatory professionals? So this one is going to be sort of something that I'm expecting a lot of feedback on as we go through the Q&A, because I'd love to hear you guys' perspective on this. So over the years of experience that I've had, and I started out as a specialist within Reg Affairs. So I've had years through all the different levels of the regulatory affairs profession. And I also did a little stint when I took some time off to actually consult. So I'll provide that perspective as well a bit later on. So from an RA engagement do standpoint, so please do remember that we are your strategic business partner. We're not just the submissions folk, right? Your RA partner is the one who's going to chart a course so you can navigate the complex and sometimes turbulent regulatory pathway. The RA voice is as important as the commercial, quality, operations, and others. Pick a function. Make sure that you include and engage your RA partner as early as possible. For the second one, right? Think of your RA resource as a long-term investment, right? So for that one, trust me, you keep your good RA people close and you treat them well. Because once they understand your products and your processes, they are invaluable. They build the relationships with the different regulators as well as your team, right? So if they can speak the language of your technical team, partner with them closely to convey the right messages to the regulators and help be that partner along the way, I think that's huge. Because getting products to the market is half the fun. Keeping them there is very entertaining as well. The other part of it that I wanted to talk about briefly was, cultural fit. So that might sound a little odd, but I think it's pretty important. As RA professionals, we don't always have good news. We try to come up with options, but there are times when we come up against a boundary and we have to deliver negative messages and we can't allow this, or maybe we won't be able to do this, but what about this as an option, right? So I think this is something that for each of your organizations or each of your efforts, you should think about, what kind of a communicator do you need for your business? And this sounds kind of odd, but I was once told by a business leader, actually, he's like, you know what, regulatory is always such a downer. I was like, a downer? That's such a cool word for us. So, so I had to help him understand that, look, our role is to flag risks, right, to the business and offer those solutions where possible, right? So how I framed, he was one that had great ideas and it's like, hey, we should do X. And my method of communicating with him initially was like, well, that sounds like a great idea, but based on this requirement, maybe we do X or Y. So I realized that was almost like, popping a happy balloon for him every time I said that, right? So instead I reframed it to say, you know what, that's a great idea. In order to facilitate this, let's look at X, right? So it became an and proposition versus me saying, hey, here's a risk and your idea is just about to go, right? So the kind of communicator you have, I think, is really important from that standpoint. All right, ready to move on to some don'ts? Here we go. So don't assume that reading a guidance document is all it takes. If I had $1 for each time I was sent a guidance document with a highlighted section or told, Google it, I would be really, really rich. But turns out there are probably multiple guidance documents that would be applicable, and there are different things that could apply, different standards. And you're not paying your RA person because we can read. The value of your RA partner is in interpreting and understanding the requirements, the regulator's latest thinking, as well as the past experiences that he or she brings. So that one, I think, is something that's a little more intangible, but really, really important. The second one is, please don't underestimate the regulatory burden. Pressure test our strategies, absolutely, but do listen to your RA partner. So an example here was the RA strategy at one business basically called for a full battery of biocomp testing, right? Because we met the threshold of, basically requiring, I don't know, I think it was like 8 tests that we needed to do. And so the team decided, you know what, we're going to do 2, and we're going to be able to justify all of the others, right? We can justify them why we don't need them. And the RA person just finally wore down and was like, guys, this is going to get challenged by the agency. But it was like, no, we believe this is, and we did. And, we are a team partner, right? So team player. So we said, all right, we helped craft the justification. So from an RA standpoint, we aligned with that, the strategy. So it turned out we did submit it. The agency came back and requested that we do the full battery of tests. So essentially, we ended up having to delay our timeline for clearance at the time because the tests had to be completed. So again, pressure test, but ultimately come to an alignment as to sometimes what seems a speed to market really won't be, right? Okay, the next one is, please don't believe in the ideal clearance or approval time. Let RA do a little bit of research and give you guys a data-driven estimate. So the fabulous example for this one, and I know I'm keeping my examples at a higher level. Again, I'm being really mindful about the businesses that I supported before and not being able to, get into like gory details around these. So this one was actually pretty cool. So it was one of the businesses that I had just transitioned into. So I think I was there my second week. I was in my first board meeting at that business. And a cool slide came up about 4 or 5 submissions that were upcoming for the organization. And the timeline was anywhere from, I think, 45 to 60 days for clearance. And I was like, wow, we are awesome, right? The published date is about 90 days. And I was like, this is awesome. So after the meeting, I connected with my RA associate and I said, hey, can you pull the last 5 clearances that we got at this business so I can see how we're tracking, right? And it turned out that none of our clearances had hit anywhere under 120 days. So my question back to the presenter of the information was like, hey, can you help me understand how we came up with 45 to 60 days? And his response was, well, I know we're trying to launch by this date, so I backed into that date, right? So essentially, we went back to the business with the RA assumptions and explained the last 5 clearances and what a realistic timeline would be for those clearances. People were not happy, but they understood. We adjusted the timeline and we met those timelines, right? And I think 1 out of the 4 came in at least, I think, a month early. So that was great, right? But imagine the business planning that went into that effort. And if we would have missed those dates, that would have been a much bigger impact to the business than us revising the timelines and making those data-driven decisions. And then the last one for me is around, don't think that an RA role is synonymous with quality or regulatory compliance. And the reason I say that is that the RA discipline is different from the others, right? So we might be looking at, a great example is a protocol, right? So if you're looking at an R&D protocol for any test, the R&D person is looking at it from a very technical standpoint. Quality is making sure that they are looking at it from the lens of how it meets our quality management system, whether it's meeting standards, et cetera. The regulatory person is not the police of those two groups. What we're looking at is, does this meet the regulatory requirements, or the regulatory requirements, as I prefer to call them? Because essentially those are the ones. This is going to be a report that goes into a 510K or a PMA or some other type of submission to a regulatory body. And I know I keep saying 510K and PMA. Those are very medical device terms, but that's my universe. So apologies to all of you out there that are not in this field. So, you know, if they're going to go into those submissions, we need to make sure that we're looking at it from the lens of our reviewers and what types of questions would we be asked. So it's just a slightly different lens and a bit of a shift, but something for you guys to think about. So with that, I'm going to shift gears once again and talk a little bit about consultants. So I'm going to put on my I need a consultant hat first. And that is being a hiring manager, right? So my perspective here is around, what do I truly need, right? Remember one of the slides early on saying, well, what are my claims? Where am I going? Do I need somebody who's going to create my strategy for me? Or am I looking for somebody who is going to start authoring a submission? Those are two very different competencies that come into play, and the cost differential can be significant, right? So if you're looking for somebody to drive strategy, that can be $400 and up, right? Or if you're looking for somebody who's, as I said, just writing a submission, the range could be anywhere from, and again, I'm based on personal experience, anywhere from $150 to $200, depending on what, again, the competency is. The next thing is check references. I know a lot of us go through agencies to bring on our contractors, but it's worthwhile asking the question, right? Just call them. Many won't have their names on submissions because they sometimes end up ghostwriting those for the business, right? But they should be able to provide some references. How did they do? How did they work in that sort of an environment? And then the other one is around mapping and tracking deliverables, right? So one example of this is just saying, here's a project, just deal with it, right? And not following up. That can be sort of a sticky wicket. From a past life experience, that's pretty much what we did. When EU MDR hit, somebody brought in a contract and it was like, they're going to be working on updating 5 tech files. And it was like, awesome, right? About a month into this, I was like, well, what's the progress? How are we mapping? Like, what's the progress that's been done? And they hadn't quite started yet because they were waiting on deliverables. But they hadn't communicated that to their manager. And so the manager was thinking that they're actually following up and getting this information, right? So I think mapping and tracking deliverables is really quite important from that standpoint. Another one is around, credentials, right? So I mentioned if somebody is really, really good at writing submissions, let's leverage them for that role. Personal life experience, we brought in somebody because we desperately needed help writing a 510K, right? Great credentials, being able to write, good references. Well, it turns out one of the business needs was actually supporting the core team to get those deliverables for the 510K. So we put her on a core team and started getting complaints. Just the team was dissatisfied, they weren't getting the information. The problem is she had never supported a core team before. So she knew what the deliverables needed to be, but was it her fault or was it ours as a business? I think it was both, right? We didn't pressure test with her whether she had done this before throwing her into this environment. And she never articulated that, hey guys, I've never done this. I focus on submissions. So that was not really a win-win situation at that point. And I don't think we did her I think we did her a disservice by not playing to her strengths, which is what she brought to us, okay? So I think focus also comes into play for small to mid-sized companies or, folk who are just starting out. So you may not be able to engage a consultant 100% of their time. So how much of their time can they truly give you, right? If they have large or multiple clients, are they going to spend a lion's share on theirs? And how much true focus are you getting? And what quality of deliverables are you getting, right? So with that, I'm going to switch. As I mentioned before, my experiences as a consultant happened only because I decided to take some time off between my J&J stint, and turns out before BD came along. And I was approached to, create strategies for a couple of people. So I basically decided, to my prior point about how much focus can they give you, I made a decision that, I'm going to take a maximum of 3 clients. And the reason for that is because I wanted to be able to do them justice by understanding their products, understanding their processes, so I could truly be a regulatory partner. So with that, I decided, let's see how I can best add value. So interestingly enough, I had one conversation with a potential client, and they wanted to know, essentially how we're going to manage their strategy. And so the first thing that they did was I provided a framework of a strategy. They took that information and said, I think we're just going to go ahead and do X instead. So my thought was the second bullet. If you already know the regulatory environment, you don't really need me. Don't pay me a bunch of money to create something for you that you're not going to follow. I will flag the risks for you, but at the end of the day, it's your business decision how you want to move forward. So it's just, being mindful of asking for expertise and then paying attention to it or not. So I think the other one for me is around the scope, right? So I was working with a client who basically had a drug device combo. And initially their strategy was to go with the drug piece of it, right? So they went and had conversations with the US FDA about the drug side, right? And they were talking about NDAs, et cetera. And then they switched gear. And at that point, they were like, actually, you know what? We've changed our strategy. We want the device to be the primary. So can you help us from a device standpoint? And that's fine, right? So having that strategy change is okay. But what I had to advise the client was, just because you're now focusing on something else, that doesn't negate the conversation you've already had with the regulator. You still need to go back and address that and explain why you changed that strategy. So it's okay to, have a scope change, but then don't be surprised if your RA strategy has to change as well. I think those were like the big things that I wanted to share as far as offering ideas around the consulting side. So I'm looking forward to the next section where we have a little conversation, to hear both Dane's and Luis's perspective on any of these. Because again, I just kind of dipped my toes into that world, and just these were some of my highlight learnings.
Hi, Neelu. We had a really good question towards the end, asking what are the key qualities of a great RA manager and leader with respect to mapping and tracking deliverables of the respective reports and consultants?
Oh my goodness, that's a really big question. All right, so I think we need to break that into 2 parts, right? One is the competencies of a regulatory manager as a leader, right? So that's the leadership part. And then the second half of it becomes more the tactical. How do you track, right? So I think leadership competencies are things that we really need to look at, right? So there are things like what type of a people manager are you? Have you been trained in how to manage people? A lot of times what happens is people are awesome as an individual contributor, and because they do so well in that, people go, you'd make an awesome manager. And then you kind of get switched to that, right? So making sure that you have like the leadership competencies of being empathetic, being a good communicator, being a servant leader. I know I hate using cliches like servant leader, but I think those are really important philosophies to have to be a good people manager. The second half of the question basically is mapping and tracking deliverables. 2 parts of that. One is if you have a consultant that you are having map and track all of these, make sure you give them the tools. What does success look like? What deliverables are they actually tracking to, right? And what does that look like? And how often do you as the manager of that consultant need to be kept in the loop? Is a weekly update good enough for you? Do you need a monthly, right? So I think it's understanding the scope of work that you have and what it is that you're giving to your consultant to handle. Hopefully that addresses the question.
Thank you very much, Neelu. I'll turn it over to Dane. Dane, did you have any follow-up ideas or questions that triggered from the presentation?
Yeah, I thought it was a great presentation, and thanks, Neelu. And I think there's a couple of maybe extensions on points that Neelu raised. When it comes to some of the engagements, my firm, we will work with clients when they need support, whether it's regulatory affairs or more quality and regulatory compliance. So I get the opportunity to go in and understand what the client's looking for, help them find the right consultant, and then help them manage the engagement. So Neelu made a really good point there on referencing. And I think checking references is important. In my industry, you know, being more the middleman, I think helping the reference process focus more on behavioral qualities is really important. A lot of people fall short on references and they call someone they know or someone that they've been provided and they say, you know, was this person a good performer? Did they deliver what you wanted? And they're kind of yes, no questions. And I think you need to get a little bit more into the detail and understand, you know, tell me about how this consultant performed on your team. Did they engage your team members well? If a scope change did pop up, how strong were they in getting the team to, you know, have tough conversations? And I think, tell me an example of how that worked. If you can start to get into those behavioral questions and you're referencing, particularly if you have a team that is not in the common practice of engaging consultants, the front end work that you do will help you bring the right person into the team and have a much better experience. So I think that's a big area.
Thanks, Dane. We had a follow-up question to the initial one. Neelu, you sort of just brushed on the fact that sometimes people are catapulted into a leadership position. Do you have suggestions, or Dane, about the leadership type of training, management type of training that are relevant, pertinent to the regulatory affairs, or I guess in general?
Sure. Depending on which organization you're with, sometimes companies have their own leadership development programs, right? So I know BD has several. I know J&J, each of our companies had multiple programs that actually had like first line leader development, right? So when you become a new leader, you actually go through a program that, you know, helps you with the basics, right? And then you can, you know, continue taking others. But if you're not part of a company that has things like that or mechanisms like that, I know LinkedIn has several you know, programs within that. I was watching something today actually talking about how do you transition from a manager to a leader, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I listened to like 5 minutes of it. But it's, you know, so there are tools that are available outside of that, outside of your business too. I don't believe in spending thousands and thousands of dollars on, you know, those, you know, leadership programs. Because I mean, give you an example. It's like, I remember having to go learn Excel, right? And that was awesome. I did it for a whole week and I could figure out, you know, functions and all that. I didn't use it for a month. And after that, it was like, oh, heck, where's my manual, right? So, so I think understanding fundamentals, particularly if there are areas like within HR that can help you find those training elements would be great, but how you practice those and how do you get feedback from your teams, right? Because a big thing for me is always asking and genuinely wanting to know, how's my driving? Is there something I could be doing better or differently, right? And the other part of it really is taking that, building the trust so that your people are able to give you that actual, you know, unfiltered feedback. Because how many times have we worked with people or for people in organizations where somebody's like, how am I doing? And you're like, you're great, right? And really it's because you're trying to give the party answer and you're not helping them improve. And when I get that answer, if somebody says, oh, you're doing great, my response is usually, look, the day I am perfect is the day I will die, because there's nothing more for me to accomplish. So please help me with something that I can improve on. Even if it's an incremental change I can make, I would rather do that. So I think it's managing through it that way. Dane, do you have any perspectives on that?
No, I agree with you on that. I'm definitely one more out of the practical school of thinking, and some of the best professionals and consultants I've dealt with, I've found that the experience that they translate into new teams is the experience that they actually got to apply in a great team setting. So you find someone, you mentioned someone who might have come through a larger company training program and then got to practice their training on a day-to-day basis. That's very strong. And then I think, you know, you see someone who's worked with a good leader who's very strong in their communications. You touched on that, Neelu. So if someone has worked in an environment where, you know, there's kickoff meetings, there's regular touch bases and check-ins, they learn from the team, they learn from the methodology, and that's a huge part of driving positive impact.
No, I think that's great. I think the one thing that I did forget to mention, I mean, along those lines exactly, is find a mentor, find a coach, right?
Yeah.
I still remember, early in my career, there was one lady who was amazing. Anytime she walked into the room, she just commanded the audience. She knew her stuff. And I always used to be like, oh my God, how do you be like you, right? And so I had the conversation with her. It's like, just ask the simple question, I think sometimes people are afraid to just set up a meeting, a 30-minute, tell me about you. How did you get to be you, right? And it's not necessarily, from a personal standpoint, it could be professional, or it could be like, how did you get that competency of being so well, having that executive presence? That lady has amazing executive presence. So I asked her about that. And some of the stories that you will hear from these leaders that somehow seem sort of out of your realm, really, it's amazing, the stories that you hear. So I would strongly encourage everybody to find or identify people to have those conversations with. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be a certain way. I mean, this is my last comment on this one is, I was invited to speak at a J&J networking event. And there was a lady who was very quiet at the back of the room, right? Just really quiet, didn't really engage, didn't participate. When it came time at the end, just to say farewell, she came up and she goes, will you be my mentor? And I said, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean to you, right? And so she goes, I want to be like you, because you talk really fast and this. And I said, all right, here's the thing. Let's have a cup of coffee and let's talk about it. I said, you don't have to be my personality. Let's look at who you are, your authentic self, and get you to be what you need to be, right? So it's understanding that you're not trying to be someone else. You're trying to elevate who you are in just a different way.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Maybe we'd shift gears a little bit and talk to the startups on the line. One of the key questions I'll just throw out there, I get asked a lot also in our firm is, when is it the right time to engage with RA professionals? Am I too early? How do you make that decision?
Sure. I think, as I said, I mean, sometimes it's as early as feasibility, or it can be as early as, you've got a concept, right? One, I guess, entrepreneur who reached out to me he goes, look, I literally have a sketch. I have nothing more than a sketch. I think it's going to be a medical device. So I said, all right, you know what? I can help you at least put the ring fences around what it could be, right? So they might help you frame your thought process a little bit, right? Because we have great ideas. My son actually develops apps, right? So he was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could do X? And I was like, okay, well, let me tell you, with that app, it's going to be a medical device, right? So from that standpoint, just having that initial guidance might be good. So an early read isn't a bad thing to get, right? And that will also help you form the next touch point where you need to have it. So I think earlier the better, just to kind of give you some idea of what that needs to be. And it can be a short conversation, right? But again, I think the key, as Dane mentioned, is like getting the right person to be your RA partner.
Yeah, I would add to that, Neelu. I love that approach, and read a great book once on how to hire the A team, and one of the key messages in the book was you've always got to be out there prospecting, networking, building those touch points. So not only do you know where to take your product, but also when you need someone, can you call them and will they be available? And I think there's an important element of having those relationships. Good people know good people too. So if you're engaging someone and you're talking to them early on about your concept, not only might they give you a few pointers in where you should go, but they might also say, hey, you should come and talk to my friend Luis or my friend Neelu, and they might have a different read for you on this particular product or geography or whatever it might be.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those two perspectives. I think they're right on cue. One thing I did want to volunteer is the importance that the regulatory perspective brings to innovation and to our startups. Look, there could be certainly someone could be in the path, in my perspective, to curing a disease or the most wonderful idea, but that could take, if it's a class 3 device, tens of millions of dollars. but there could be completely oversight of an initial market entry point that perhaps somebody with a regulatory perspective could bring in. And I think that could be a lot of value for a leader of a startup to have in mind, and just have that dialogue, maybe as Dane mentioned, in a casual way or in a formal way. So here's what we're thinking, and are there possible ways we get into market earlier, especially in the software side? There's a lot of innovators that go into software. That could be a perspective. Then potentially for diagnostics, potentially for medical devices, there's ways to build sort of very specific regulatory market access plans where it tailors to potentially your investors, or how much capital you have, or how much time you have, which is not for, say, the home run initially, but it gets you a foot in the door. So that's one perspective that perhaps comes to mind in terms of how early. A follow-on to that is the whole big question about the design freeze, and how regulatory affairs is involved. Did you guys want to talk a little bit about that conundrum? When is it just the sketch you mentioned, Neelu, or when is that a formal design freeze that should start to be documented under a quality system, and perhaps tied into that potentially when you can start engaging with regulatory agencies?
Yeah, so I think design freeze, if we're again in this healthcare environment, the regulated healthcare environment, you've got the regulatory affairs piece, then you've got the quality system under which you need to work, right? Mm-hmm. So even the sketch on a napkin scenario, you need to start thinking about from a quality system, what do you need, right? As you develop that, you need a new product development process, right? What's your life cycle look like? So these are those big questions that sometimes, when you're just this great idea that's come along, it's really hard to kind of go, oh God, I've got to do this bureaucratic nonsense, right? But unfortunately, that is the reality of, again, at the end goal, as I said, the importance of our why. The why is that there's a patient at the end, right? So I want to make sure that I do things correctly. So having that quality system element, which again, it's not, you can get, great consultants around that side of it too, right? That can walk you through how to create a quality system and what does it truly mean. It doesn't have to be onerous. It just, the system needs to serve you as well as provide the regulators with the guidelines that they need, right? So putting your documentation into it as early as possible, right, I think will help the cause with how you move forward. So I don't know if that helps at all, but any adds to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to also, what I see often is two extremes. One is pushing that design freeze too late. So there's initial clinical validation data that's done with a hospital, but they thought they're too early, so we were not going to document that. And a regulatory professional would have been able to say, hey, let's take a step back. We're actually gathering clinical information here. And that goes into a lot of the diagnostic side. Let's see if we could put a framework where this could be an initial, information that we can leverage. The second part is, so pushing that too far is a risk. Pushing it too early is another risk that perhaps, is important in terms of the mindset from a regulatory standpoint. If you just have a schematic and, haven't done some initial testing, don't really know what the classification is, let's not call that a design freeze because you're just going to tie yourself up. So there's a delicate balance. And Neelu, you mentioned we're not paid because we know how to read, but we bring in the experience. That's where the experience comes in to be able to say, I think now's the right time. Let's call this, an initial prototype and start building a technical file so that the company can start progressing.
I think it ties into the whole target product profile too, right? Yeah. So once you have your target product profile, what is it, what are the claims, et cetera, at some point when you believe, as you said, you have a prototype that you go, okay, this is doing all of the stuff I need it to per my TPP, that could be an initial freeze, a design freeze. The whole concept of design freeze really is to allow you to then go, this is what is going to be the final thing. So I'm going to test this against all the requirements, right, to get it to market. But if you initiate testing and then you change a fundamental component, you're just going to have to repeat everything. So again, to your point, Luis, it's be mindful of what you consider a design freeze.
Wonderful. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. One important aspect of a regulatory affairs profession is not just that approval of the post-market, but it's also the payer. Someone had brought up that in the chat room. So maybe you could elaborate the do's and don'ts from a regulatory standpoint as you think about who's going to actually pay for this, and what are some potential good foundations to lay at the beginning to have success?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because again, so reg compliance, talking with payers, there's so many adjacencies. Remember I talked about the bubbles under my, my bubbles? It's one of those, right? So unfortunately, and again, I haven't been involved in that conversation for a few years now, but I remember going to an event where you had CMS and FDA, right? And we were talking about, hey, wouldn't it be great? We're generating all this data for our submissions. Can we just give this to you so we can get that payer information up front? And unfortunately, we were not at that time able to connect those. So I think that's a difficult challenge. And again, I think you have specialists in that reimbursement arena that can work with you early on in the process, along with your regulatory person, to define some of the testing. So for example, if you're going to be doing clinical testing, right? If you're going to be doing a clinical study, why not put in some, benefits to life type of questions, right? Or, some softer areas that could be used to support that reimbursement argument. So it's just, assessing what it is that you're doing and then seeing if you can add something. So it becomes more of an ad versus having to do a completely separate study or a separate discussion, I guess.
Thank you. Dane, did you have anything to add?
On that one, no, other than the fact that I know a really good guy who finds consultants in that particular area.
Well, I just wanted to throw out there, it's sort of like echoing Neelu's perspective. The whole payer side in healthcare economics is becoming such a key part. So just for people to sort of have in mind, you structure a clinical trial or a validation, right? There is the clinical requirements for approval, and then there's the reimbursement requirements, and that could very well be married, but a lot of times it's an afterthought. And you run through a trial 3 years later, find out you should have asked for your controls. How long did they stay in the hospital? and that could be equivalent to dollars. So that's something to think about early. And I was just mentioning Dane because Australia is one of those notorious ones where it's very much migrated to value-based reimbursement. So the more you can capture in terms of that healthcare economics, the better off you are for international markets. It's certainly true as well for the US market. I think we're getting at some questions about startups. One of the open-ended ones is when is a good time, or what are good sort of ideas to address to go and engage with the FDA? Maybe some anecdotes or how to incorporate the RA perspective into the pre-submission meetings, perhaps, or meetings with FDA.
So I love pre-subs. I think once FDA opened up that door, it was a really great opportunity for businesses, and recognize that there are multiple types of pre-subs, right? The term pre-sub is like pre-submission, right? So in a way, it's kind of implying that, you go in with a submission at the end of the line, which is fine. There's also one which is like an informational pre-sub, which could be a great avenue for organizations to come in and I say organization, for people to come in and go through their portfolio. One of my past lives, we used to go annually to the agency and say, okay, this is our pipeline. Let us tell you a little bit about each of the products that we have in development, right? And roughly when they're going to hit, right, from a submission standpoint. What that did was two things. Number one, it gave us an opportunity of socializing something that we may be able to get some feedback on, right? The second one was it helps FDA plan their timeline too, right? Because they have resource issues too, right? So how do we help them manage that? The informational pre-sub is one where they don't generally talk, right? You're going in to present information. So the benefit of that one that I've found is, again, you're putting our best foot forward, right? To describe whatever it is that we're doing. But the pre-meeting and at the end of the meeting, sometimes you get these really good little nuggets as to, hey, I noticed that you put this up there. Here's just a comment for you to consider. That's kind of like gold when you get that feedback from the agency. Another one that we use a lot is the true pre-sub, right? Which, and I shouldn't say the true pre-sub, but the pre-sub where you ask questions, right? So you present information. If you want feedback on a protocol, something that's particularly onerous, I don't know, pick something, human factors, right? Because human factor studies cost a bunch of money, right? So wouldn't it be great if you got early read from the agency on what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it, what your sample size is, and that, you know, the outcome, right? So you can have a pre-sub where you say, hey, FDA, this is our plan. We have these 3 questions. Do you agree with our sample size? Do you agree with the methodology based on what I'm telling you? They will give you that feedback. So that could help companies mitigate the risk of then, after you submit, the agency coming back and saying, yeah, this isn't quite what we were looking for, right? Mm-hmm. So I think pre-subs are awesome. Again, there is that, you know, the double-edged sword though, of be careful what you ask for. Because sometimes I used to get asked, it's like, let's just ask FDA what they want us to do. Or let's just talk to BSI and ask them and it's like, that's sort of like a blank piece of paper and saying, okay, right? Because once you get that feedback, you either do what they have told you to do, or now you spend a bunch of time trying to justify or rationalize why you're not going to do it. So it's much better to be very targeted and mindful. Be mindful in what you're asking. So like I said, I love pre-subs. So there you go.
Yeah, this is one of the topics I'm very passionate about is, you know, communication is key, but there's something to be said about being well prepared, right? FDA has the shortage of time. And one thing we advise companies to not do is to go there and ask him, you know, very open-ended questions like you mentioned. You know, this is a one time where leading the witness is good because FDA or BSI, they're not consultants, right? You do that with a potential regulatory affairs team member, but you go to them and say, we believe this is a class 2 medical device. Do you agree or not with us? As opposed to, what classification do you think this product could be? And I think that, you know, the FDA is you know, supposed to be conservative. So that's one thing. The other thing that I'd mention is the importance of, I'm not saying you have to have a regulatory member to do a pre-submission meeting, but I will say you have to have very closely and diligently thought with a regulatory hat before you have that meeting, because we certainly get a lot of companies that kind of have blown it out of proportion because they've asked some open-ended questions and they really weren't prepared. And that first step with the FDA is a very important one. So, you know, there was a question I'll open up to you guys to your perspective. You know, is it necessary to have an FDA consultant, or is it a good idea to go directly to the FDA? And whether another good distinction to make, does that consultant have to be a regulatory attorney or a regulatory consultant?
Yeah, I think so. Let's address that. The first thing is be really mindful of the regulatory consultants that you bring in, right? Because this is a very make or break sort of initial, you know, engagement with the agency, right? I think it is important to have a good regulatory person advise on what that pre-sub looks like. And when I was consulting, I say, one of my clients was planning on going to the agency for a pre-sub, right? And they were like, oh, we'll just submit a bunch of information. And they had I think 8 or 9 questions. And I was like, well, actually, if we look at the guidance document and past life experience, FDA, maybe 3, 4, 5 questions is kind of pushing it, right? So, and then how target, so they decided to craft the questions. So it was 1A, 1B, 1C. And I'm like, really? No, let's not play those kinds of games, right? At the end of the day, it's how you show up, the reputation you're walking in with, right? Because they're going to be gauging you after that one it's like anybody else, right? If I have a terrible presentation, or if I, you know, meet with you and leave you with a, oh my God, that Neelu. Next time I come in, you're going to be like, oh, it's her again, right? So how do you build a relationship? Because each one of these is a step towards a relationship. So I would suggest, at a minimum, if you want to put your packet together and you want to have the prep, it's really important for companies to have a pre-submission prep meeting. Who's going to be speaking? Do they know how to present? It's not an opportunity for somebody to grandstand. That's not it, right? It's very targeted. So I would suggest that you, at least before you submit your pre-sub packet, have a conversation with a regulatory professional just to be, you know, like, how's my driving, even that sort of thing. Can you take a look at the pre-sub packet from a critical lens? The team is planning on saying X, what do you think? So, but prepare, that's the big thing that you hit on.
And your perspective on whether to have a regulatory attorney versus a regulatory professional and the distinction, maybe some in the audience might not know.
I think, and Dane, I would love to hear your perspective on this, right? A regulatory attorney for me looks at, and you guys, any regulatory attorneys in the audience, please tell me we're completely wrong if I'm completely wrong, right? But in my mind, they look at how the company, business, product meets the intent of the regulation, right? The regulatory environment. What Reg Affairs does is we tell the story of how we meet that requirement, right? So having a regulatory attorney can provide a perspective, but again, not all reg attorneys have gone to pre-sub meetings with the agency. Not all Reg Affairs people have gone to pre-sub meetings with FDA either, but the ones who talk from a submission standpoint tend to be your Reg Affairs folk. But I don't want to do a disservice to regulatory attorneys either, because they are awesome business partners. And if you have an option, take both.
I don't know, Dane, if you wanted to add anything. Otherwise, I think there's one key question that maybe I'd like you to elaborate, Dane.
The only thing I would touch on there, Luis, was I agree on the narrative piece that Neelu touched on, that the consultant brings to that pre-submission meeting. And, you know, as I've grown up in the sales world, and I know in your industry things can get really caught up on technical and compliance and everything else. But at the end of the day, particularly if you're a startup and you're going in its early days with the FDA or any other regulatory body around the world, I've always been coached that you go in with a strong narrative, because stories tend to engage people better. So that pre-prep meeting's key, and then treating it like, you know, Super Bowl Sunday. You know, it might be that one opportunity to make a very strong mark that you can continue to build off. So I think there's a lot of value in preparing and bringing the consultants in, even if it's just to kind of be a mock participant to sit there and give you feedback. I think that's really powerful.
Phenomenal. Thank you very much. I wanted to expand on the different modalities that a regulatory professional can be engaged. So there's a temporary, there's the consultant, there's the full-time. Any thoughts on that? Maybe you can expand. Maybe people have not thought about possibilities and maybe typical arrangements that might be a good setup for success.
Absolutely. Neelu, did you want to kick off?
I was going to say, I'm excited to hear your answer to that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a moving target, unfortunately, with AB5, for any of those who have been following it, which is on again, off again. There's a lot of challenge right now on engaging independent consultants here in California. It's not that you can't do it, but you need to have certain scrutiny and methodology to how you engage someone contractually and how you set out scope. And in the future, it may well change. So I think, first of all, understanding how to engage someone compliantly with the right contracts, and then the right language and procedures in how you engage is essential. And there's a few different playbooks for that. And then secondly, it really comes down to the talent, because, you know, as you heard of Neelu earlier, you might come across someone who's between two staff positions and is consulting with a few clients, and they only want a small amount of time. Or you might find someone who you absolutely have to have. They've got domain expertise, and the only way they'll engage with you is full-time as an employee through an agency or through their own consulting firm. So I think there's an art, and it is more art than science, to really mapping out what talent is available in your network that you can draw in, what's the compliant way to engage them, and then what's cost effective too. And I think getting that together is really critical.
Neelu?
Yeah, I think it was going to be one of the bullets that I had in my slide, was depending on where your business is, right? and what your long-term trajectory is going to be. So if you're starting out early, you don't have funding yet, it might just be worthwhile, you know, making that initial investment and having a regulatory consultant come in and do that spot check or that initial regulatory strategy, right? And I've been involved in that, right? So somebody was literally starting up and I was like, okay, let me just map out, give me all the options that you are thinking. What directions do you think you could possibly go in? And I can create a strategy for you for each one of those. And then once you decide which one you want to do, then we can re-engage, or you can engage with somebody else, right? So I think there's a benefit from that standpoint. I think as you become more embroiled in defining the testing that you need to do and start executing against that, it is important again. So consultant versus employee, I think as you become more established, sometimes it's just the ability to hire somebody, because it's a big deal actually bringing on a FTE versus bringing on a consultant. So I think funding and where you are in your business life cycle is going to be important to help with that decision.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. This is a little bit of a curveball, but actually there's a big question about people get, there was a question here, how did you get into regulatory affairs? Maybe you can elaborate, how did you got where you are? And Neelu, can you talk about your book?
No, no. I should, if I talk about my book, you have to talk about your guitar.
No, thank you.
Okay, so, that's an interesting question, because nowadays there are actually master's programs in reg affairs, right? When I started back in the day of horse and carriage days, right? So I actually fell into RA. So I was actually an environmental engineer. I joined my first J&J company in environmental. And we were actually having an inspection from the county, and I was presenting to the management board, right? So I went in and I was like, okay, here are the 3 things you guys need to know in case the auditor comes in and talks to you. The VP of RA at that point said to me at the end of the meeting, he goes, do you have like 10 minutes to grab a cup of coffee downstairs? And I was like, oh, I have a cup of tea, but sure. And he said, I actually have a position open in regulatory affairs, and if you're interested, I'd love to talk to you about it. And coming from the UK, you can probably tell from the accent, right? But I did not know who FDA was, right? So I was like, sure. But, when he described some of the elements of what that was, I decided to make that career change. So again, I was very early in my career, right? So I was able to move across from an environmental engineer to an RA specialist, or might have been a senior specialist. But the question that I often get is, if you're further along, if you're a director in quality, for example, and you want to make the switch to regulatory, that's a little bit more difficult, right? Because you've already got a discipline under your belt. And now you're coming across to a discipline. If you're looking to come in at that director level, that's a little bit more difficult, right? So how do you facilitate that? I'm not saying it's impossible, but how do you facilitate that, right? So areas like that, my experience would say, see if there's a way for you to have a part of your time that you can negotiate with your manager that you can spend in RA, right? Start helping us with a submission, start helping us with something else to get that level of experience. So at some point, and it needs to be sort of a defined point, that you are able to make that transition. So, I mean, I was fortunate that, I started at the ground floor and I've gone through the ranks, making the leap from project manager to people manager, then from from manager to director, which is another big leap, right? And so to be able to do that and navigate that, I think, again, these are one of those conversations that, have a conversation with somebody who, who's done that in RA, and do that over a drink or a cup of coffee. So, Dane, how about you? Any thoughts?
I'm 100%. I mean, I started actually, got my first real job in this profession in a bar when I met someone, and most other jobs have either come about from networking that I did well ahead of time. They weren't all in the bar, but at the end of the day, this industry, like all industries, are very people driven, and having the right introductions, the right people to bounce off and either have as a mentor, as you touched on earlier, Neelu, or to maybe make an introduction is really key to finding your way through.
Yeah, and I think the one other thing that I'd like to add is, we all have aspirations, right? But I had a conversation with somebody in clinical a long time ago. We were just having a mentoring discussion. And for the first 15 minutes of the 30 minutes, she was telling me about, I should be trained, I need this, I think I can do X, right? So when she paused for breath for a moment, I said, okay, let me ask you one question. What are you doing for the company? What are you doing for the function, right?
Yep.
So I think one key element that we have to remember is do your job. Do your job fantastically, right? Do it well. It's great to have aspirations and it's great to create the development plans, but don't lose sight of what it is that you're doing and why. Again, I'm bringing us back to a why. Why are you doing this?
Yep.
Why do you want to be? Another question that I ask people is, why do you want to be a people manager? And I'm going to, obviously to all the people in the audience, I'm giving away one of my big secrets now. But inevitably, my question is, well, why do you want to be a people manager? And the number one answer I get is, well, because that's the next step in my career development. What I'm looking for is for somebody to say, because I really love developing people. I love mentoring people, and I would love to be in a capacity where I can help people. That's why you should want to be a people manager, because, well, you care about people, right? So.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we didn't get a moment to get through all the questions. Dana, sorry I interrupted you. I'll let you finish that and then ask one last question before handing over back to Karen. Dane, did you have something to add to that?
Just one really brief thing, which was I think Neelu just touched on, doing a great job of what you're in. And one of my favorite employees here in the business is very self-made. He was working in quality for a drilling company, believe it or not. And from working in drilling, he became really good at working with suppliers in their supply chain, the original equipment manufacturers, and basically managed to transfer his way in and start to pick up qualifications and good mentors, so that now in the medical device world, he's a really top consultant for remediation projects and manufacturing line transfers and all of that. And it just came because he became very good at his core tasks. He made really good impressions on the suppliers and the outside consulting firms that he worked with, and just the product of his work pulled him through. So I think that is a huge point.
Great. Well, I'd like to, maybe my last question would be how to manage expectations in terms of timelines. Maybe for those who are engaging regulatory consultants and are shooting them because there's delays, what tends to be big surprises and best practices when thinking regulatory approval timelines?
Yeah, I think two things, right? For somebody who's never done a submission before, so they don't have their own history, because I always think you should look at your past before you look at your future, right? So if you don't have those data sets, go on the FDA website, look at other like type devices or something that comes close, and figure out how long it took them to get their clearances or approvals, right? Because that will then give you something to shoot for. If you've never done a submission and your expectation is you are not going to get questions from the regulatory body, let's not imagine that. You will get the first round. So build in like contingencies initially, right? But as you continue to have your conversations with the agencies, if you do pre-subs, for example, that might give you a little bit more confidence in what your timelines are. But look to available data as you make those timelines.
Dane, if you had anything to add?
Again, it's not my domain expertise. So if someone came and asked me on that, I'd help them find the right consultant or introduce them to you.
Yeah. Well, with that, I close out. Thank you very much, Dane. Neelu, thank you so much. Karen, it's been a pleasure. I'll hand it over to you. I see a koala that's awesome.
Yeah, love it.
Here we go.
Love it.
Like a koala.
Well, thank you, Dane and Neelu and Luis, for joining us today on this webinar, talking about exciting regulatory affairs today. Thank you for sharing your insight and sharing your time with our startups and our community here.